Um, Greetings. I'm recording this lecture for chapter 5 ahead of time because I have to go somewhere tomorrow and I'll be on the road at the normal time that I record these lectures. So I hope you don't mind if I just upload it to the content as a pre recorded lecture. Okay, so let me just share my screen here. This chapter 5 is about uh, evaluating art, which has already come up in some of your questions for the discussion. People have asked questions like, uh, why is some art more valued than other art? Why is this good and this is bad? Why is this worth $1 million and this is not worth anything? If I made that exact thing, would it be worth millions of dollars? Things like that. Those are great questions and they'll come up over and over again in the course, but this lecture is dedicated to examining some of those questions, including the question of censorship, which is pretty important. Okay, so first let's look at a painting that was originally considered to be a bad painting. Cody likes it though. Okay, and this is the first Impressionist painting um, from the 19th century by Claude Monet. Now, if the Frisk Art Museum had a Monet show, people would buy tickets months in advance. They would pay, $25 to get in. His paintings sell for millions of dollars, and we'll look at one in just a minute that recently sold for 110 million. So nowadays, the Impressionists are revered, but in their own time, they were considered just plain weird. And this painting was considered not a finished or completed painting, but just a sketch. In fact, a critic the name Impressionism for this movement, which we'll study later in the course, comes from the fact that critics, when they saw these paintings, said it looked like a mere impression. That is, Monet was out in his boat, he made a few little notes on a canvas with oil paint and called it a day, and that wasn't a finished academic landscape painting in the view of critics of the time. But here's another painting by Monet called Haystacks that sometime in the last couple of years sold for $110 million. So nowadays, Monet's paintings are some of the most valuable paintings in the world. So it just goes to show you. All right, so there's actually a website called the Museum of Bad Art. And maybe I should link to that in your content. I don't think I did yet. But your book has compares these two paintings to sort of illustrate the idea of bad art. It's not that there is no bad art. There is bad art. There's definitely art that's made with less skill, for example, than other art. And that's what this comparison really emphasizes. So on the left you have a painting from the Museum of Bad Art, which is kind of a fun website to look at by some unknown artist. And let's just talk about what's quote unquote bad about this painting on the left. So it's just it on one level maybe it's okay. It's by a self-taught artist or a naive artist or maybe a folk artist, an untrained artist, clearly. The forehead kind of bulges out too much over here. You can see this is not the way your forehead really looks. The eyebrow is kind of weird and unnatural. The eyelashes are painted not as they actually look, but as little separate lines. What is this? Is this supposed to be a highlight on her cheek or something? Um, it's like she kind of phoned in the hair It's not very realistic. It may be a little bit abstract, you could say that. But I mean, maybe some people like this kind of art. Again, it's subjective, right? We've already talked about that, about the fact that what's good and bad is pretty subjective. What you like and what I like may be different. Okay, so on the right is a painting by a famous female French artist of the 18th century. And Vigée Lebrun was a trained artist. Her father was an artist, and she was one of the few lucky women in the 18th century who got actual artistic training, and it shows. Okay, so she knows how to paint in the academic style that is of her time, of the 18th century or the 1700s. And it was, that style was fairly representational or realistic. You know, she understands this is a self-portrait of a young woman, a pretty young woman who is also an artist. And, you know, she's got the proportions of the head and the body right. She understands what happens when light falls on the body and on the face, and how the hat casts a shadow. And so all of that is very good. And, you know, she's able to render the neckline of this, the fancy neckline of this silk dress, and the hands. And believe me, drawing hands is incredibly hard. She's nailed that. I mean, everything is perfect from a academic art point of view. And in fact, Vigée Lebrun was commissioned to make many portraits of, she was Marie Antoinette's favorite portraitist, um, before Marie Antoinette died. And tragically, we know what happened to her. Anyway, but it's a little boring. I mean, I think to modern taste, this painting is technically amazing, but it's not all that interesting, except maybe to a painter who's trying to figure out how to do this sort of academic painting. But it's completely conventional. It doesn't break any new ground, really. Okay. Okay, so when uh, artists talk, when critics, let's say, and you're becoming a critic, you're going to be doing some writing about an art exhibit that you're going to visit. So you're learning basically to be an art critic. And so people, what do art critics do? So they write about art using different sort of theories about art. And one of those theories that we're going to talk about is formalism, which is one of the terms that's um, on the list of terms that I put in the content for chapter 5. Now, one of the problems with Zoom is that this screen sharing thing sort of covers up some of this Basquiat painting, I'm sorry to say. At least that's how I see it. Maybe you don't, there's like a green line that says you were screen sharing. Maybe you don't see that. Okay, so this is your book goes into a really in-depth analysis of this painting that I think is really good and really brilliant. Your textbook is great. And that's why, you know, I insist that people buy it. It's really one of the best textbooks I've ever taught from, and the analysis of this painting in particular is really, really good. And it sort of walks you through the steps of formal analysis, meaning analysis of the visual forms in the painting and what they could mean or how they work, basically. So this painting is a triptych. Again, that word is on the list of terms that I put in the content. And it's called Horn Players. Okay, so on your left you see a guy with a sax. That's Charlie Parker, who was a famous bebop, African American bebop saxophonist in the 1950s. Kind of burned out early, like Basquiat, but Basquiat didn't know he was going to burn out early, I don't think. But Charlie Parker also had a lot of drug problems like Basquiat later developed. So in a way, this painting is kind of weirdly prophetic. And then on the right is Dizzy Gillespie, who was a trumpet player around the same time in the 50s. And in the middle, there's this weird panel. So a triptych is 3 panels, either canvas or wood, sort of mounted together or exhibited together. And on the central panel, there's that skull again that Basquiat uses in so many of his paintings, but also typical of Basquiat's work, there's a lot of words on the painting. So let's just sort of go through the words first. So one of the words is ornithology, which is written on the right panel a couple of times, 3 times, and then on the middle panel, but weirdly, and crossed out on the left panel. So what does ornithology refer to? So Charlie Parker his nickname was Bird. And ornithology is the study of birds. And in fact, Charlie Parker released an album that was called Ornithology. So the left panel's more or less about Charlie Parker. It has the word Pre on it, which was his girlfriend's name or his daughter's name. I'm not sure which. And then the right panel is about Dizzy Gillespie, and it says alchemy, 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 alchemy. So one article that I read about this painting said that alchemy refers to the sort of jazz aspect of both to jazz itself, which is a kind of alchemy. That is a mixing of different influences to create something new. That is African rhythms and American music and classical music. And all those things come together to make a unique American music form called jazz. And Basquiat saw his own painting in similar terms. That is, his painting was a kind of bringing together of disparate elements into one new art form that he was kind of inventing in a way, a kind of graffiti painting, really. So that may be what alchemy means. And then, but the puzzling thing is the skull in the middle. So is that a reference to Basquiat himself? It could be, because it's part of his iconography, which we know, artists have their own personal iconography, and his sometimes revolved around this skull. But your book points out something really interesting, I think. And that is that Basquiat, when he painted, his mother had taken him to art museums from the time he was a little kid. And so he grew up in Brooklyn. So he was always going to museums in New York as a child, and he knew a lot about art by the time he was kind of self-taught. I don't think he ever went to art school, but growing up in New York and going to these museums, he was familiar with visual art, the history of visual art, really, especially modern art, and especially Picasso, who was one of his inspirations. And so, when he worked in his studio, and you can see a short film of him working, which is in the content for chapter 5. He had art books open on tables in his studio. He was listening to jazz, sometimes like jazz from the 50s. Sometimes he had the TV on. I mean, he just had all these references out. And the writer of your textbook makes this interesting connection with this Picasso painting called Three Musicians. So similar to Basquiat's painting, it's not a triptych, but there are 3 figures in it. A horn player over here on the left, seemingly a guitar player in a weird sort of multicolored suit, and then maybe a singer on the right. It's hard to tell, but this person seems to be holding a musical score. Yeah, I see you. And to have on some kind of a mask or veil over his face. So it's these may be black musicians. I don't know. Picasso painted them as if they are. Maybe this was from one of his trips to North Africa or something like that. So this figure in the center in the Picasso painting has this huge lower jaw sort of sticking out as if he's singing really loud, like ah! And it's cross-hatched with yellow markings. So let's go back to the Basquiat painting. And you can and this jaw is just sticking out in a really unnatural way. And similarly, the head on this the back of the head of this skull is also has this bulge, and it has little, not exactly cross hatching, but little paint marks on the back of it that, according to the critic, reference this painting. So he says that Basquiat is making a reference to Picasso's painting. Maybe. Okay, so how, and here we can see this more directly. This is the Picasso head, and this is the Basquiat head. There does seem to be a sort of influence here, even if not a direct reference. And here we can see them side by side. And I think when you look at them side by side, you have to admit there it does look like Basquiat was thinking about the Picasso painting, which is very dark in the background here. And Basquiat made his painting on a dark background like the Picasso painting. So, and here's a picture. This is a picture of Charlie Parker Bird from when he was still alive. And this is a picture of Basquiat in his studio painting, working on several. He worked on several paintings at once usually, and he could turn out an amazing number of paintings in a week apparently. And he was selling these paintings for a lot of money. So one of the other consideration that a critic takes into account when writing an essay about, say, this Basquiat painting is the context of the painting. What was going on at the same time and place where the painting was made. So this is the 1983, and Basquiat is living in the downtown area of New York, the sort of southern end of Manhattan, which was called the downtown part, lower end of Manhattan. And I mean, now that's a really expensive place to live. But in the 80s, and before that, for several decades until I guess the 90s, artists could find spaces in the village, Greenwich Village, and generally the downtown area. They could rent huge loft spaces and warehouse type spaces for living and working relatively cheaply. And in the early 80s, the downtown art scene was not just a visual art scene, it was a music scene, it was a film scene, it was just a cultural mecca kind of for young artists. And it was a huge, huge party scene, apparently. I mean, I used to go to New York in the 70s, around 1975 and 76. I worked in New Jersey, not too far from New York, and I would go to New York on the weekends. And it was kind of a grim city then. It was having a lot of problems. Sometimes there was no trash pickup. There was a lot of crime. It was kind of a scary city, although even then Greenwich Village was an exciting place to visit. There were a lot of cool bookstores and jazz clubs and things like that. But by the 80s, it was a really happening place. And, you know, everybody who was anybody wanted to be living in downtown New York, whether you were a musician or a visual artist. Everybody had some sort of project like that, and they all partied like it was going out of style at night. Apparently they went out every night, and Basquiat went out every night. But then during the day he worked on his paintings. He had amazing work ethic, apparently. So, why is this even relevant? It's relevant because this was the sort of that cultural ferment of the early 80s in lower Manhattan was was the birthplace of early rap, apparently, which eventually evolved into hip hop. So there was a lot of musical innovation going on in lower Manhattan at that time in these nightclubs that Basquiat and his friends went out to every night. And Basquiat is sort of talking about, in this painting, he's talking about another period in New York of musical innovation, that is the 1950s, when Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie were inventing modern jazz or bebop, which evolved out of Dixieland jazz, which came from New Orleans, which came from African American musicians. So he's kind of referencing this whole history of African American innovation and invention and art, and putting himself right in the center of that. That is, I am an African American artist. I'm an innovator. I'm bringing together all these different influences, just like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie did. And I'm a visual artist, not a musician mainly, but it's the same thing. It's the same alchemy that I'm using here. Okay, so when you write about a painting like this, you you evaluate it. That is, you talk about its place in art history. Why is it important? Why should a collector pay a lot of money for it even? You're going to be talking about those things. You're going to talk about the formal qualities, the way the shapes, the way he repeats these shapes. For example, these white shapes that kind of pull the you know pull the three panels together. And Basquiat was really careful about that. It may look chaotic, but the more you look at it, the more you can see that he was trying to establish some kind of unity. Yes, there's a lot of variety, but there's a unifying sort of background, these box shapes. Who knows what this soap thing means? I don't know. But there's certain shapes and colors that recur throughout the painting, these yellow shapes on this side pop up over here. This red color is everywhere. So you can do this kind of formal analysis of just the visual elements here, line, color, shape, all that, and say, yeah, it hangs together visually, even if you don't know anything about Charlie Parker or Dizzy Gillespie or the downtown art scene. You can see that visually it hangs together. So that's important, the formal qualities. Also, when you're evaluating a painting like this, you ask yourself, is there any innovation here? Or is it just the same old? Oh, oh, that's funny. His when he was a graffiti artist, he was his sort of graffiti tag. What he called himself was Samo, Samo, like same old. But obviously, Basquiat was not. He didn't want to be the same old, same old. So, was it innovative? Did Basquiat do something that hadn't been done before? Did he do something that Picasso hadn't done? And I would say yes, he did. He took the graffiti style and he made it a fine art style, you know. And also he kind of brought back expressionism, which we'll talk about later. He was a neo-expressionist, you could say. Expressionism had sort of been gone for a while in American art until Basquiat and some other artists brought it back. And also, did it have, does this painting have meaning in the context of its place and time? That's another thing you should think about when you're evaluating something. Yes, I mean, it's all about that downtown art scene, but it places that downtown art scene, art and music scene, in the context of a previous period of innovation and creativity. That is the 1950s when bebop jazz was invented. Does it, another thing to think about is, does it evoke a feeling in you? Does it move you, basically? So some people might not be moved by this. That's where the subjectivity comes in. I I find it both intense, but also it has a kind of cool in the sense of standoffish quality to it. It's not as in your face as that skull that we looked at in the first lecture by Basquiat. It's more, I wouldn't say it's intensely passionate or moving, but the more you know about it, the more you know what these figures meant to Basquiat, the more important and sort of emotionally resonating it is. Does it express the zeitgeist? So the zeitgeist just means the spirit of its age. I should put that on the list of terms. And is it beautiful? I mean, I love it. But, to be good, an artwork doesn't have to be beautiful. It can be challenging. That is like the Jessica Stockholder sculpture that we looked at a couple of lectures ago. I can't remember exactly. The last lecture, maybe. That sculpture is challenging. It's not beautiful, and I wouldn't want it in my house, but I have respect for it because it made me think about a lot of things. And so, you know, it doesn't have to be beautiful in the classic sense to be a good work of art, I think. Okay, so now we're going to move on to another topic in the area of evaluating art, and that is censorship. So censorship just means when something is deemed too bad, to put it simply, to show to people. But the first instance of censorship that we're going to look at is weird because it's art that the Nazis censored, but before they censored it, they showed it to everybody. So on this slide, you see two different posters, basically. They're side by side, but they were originally separate. Okay, on this side, on the left side, you see the Great German Art Exhibit. That's what it says in German, 1937. So this was an exhibit, Hitler had taken power by this time in Germany, and he was the chancellor, and he and Goering, I think, wanted to mount this show of the best German art. And they had built a new art museum specifically to hold the art of the Third Reich, But right around the corner from this official great German art show was another art show of bad art. And that's what you see on this side. Entartete Kunst. And art, the word Kunst, is in scare quotes. Like, this is not really Kunst. It's not really art. It's degenerate art. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to look at what the Nazis thought was degenerate art that shouldn't be in the Great German Art Exhibit. I'm not sure what this word means down here, but I think it says something about the Fuhrer. He's furious. He's just furious. Okay, so what the Entartete Kunst show did was, and I'm going to move this window down here so you can read these slogans. All right, so what they did was they confiscated art from art museums and collections all over Germany, including privately owned collections of modern art mostly, and they took some of it out of its frames, so and hung it in this exhibit hall with these slogans on the wall to let you know when you went in this show that the paintings were bad. That is, they didn't leave it up to chance. I mean, they didn't want you to think it was bad. It was good, right? So they tell you what it is. Insolent mockery of the divine. Revelation of the Jewish racial soul, which is obviously bad because they were getting ready to kill all the Jews. an insult to German womanhood. The ideal is Cretan, that means backwards person, intellectually disabled person, and whore, deliberate sabotage of national defense. Uh-oh. German farmers, a Yiddish view. Yiddish means Jewish, so apparently insulting to German farmers. The Jewish longing for the wilderness reveals itself. In Germany, the Negro becomes the racial ideal of a degenerate art. So obviously, the racism of the Nazis is on full display here. Madness becomes method, nature as seen by sick mind. So, what were these paintings that the Nazis thought were so terrible? Well, it would have been something like this sculpture on the left. This is one of the sculptures that was in the Degenerate Art Show. It's hard to see what was so terrible about this. It's called The Reunion, and it seems to show a man and maybe an older woman embracing. Okay, it's slightly abstract. It's not purely representational. It could be a reference to a soldier reuniting with his mother after World War One. It was made in 1926. World War One had ended in 1918. It was a disaster for Germany. Um, Millions and millions of German men had died in World War One, and some of them returned just terribly maimed without legs or arms or even faces. So maybe that's what this is about. I mean, to me, that seems like a perfectly normal subject of art, or it could be a Bible story. I mean, they're dressed in kind of biblical looking robes. But it wasn't good enough for the Nazis. And in fact, even some Nazis couldn't quite figure out what Hitler and Goering thought was okay. What were the criteria? The criteria were not clear. But what was clear was that something like this, a sort of idealized um, version of German youth, was what Hitler and Goering and Goebbels, I think Goebbels was in on this too, what they wanted. So, and also, okay, here's Goebbels entering the Degenerate Art Show, where abstraction, this is slightly abstract. This is pretty abstract. And expressionism, that's the other thing they hated. Abstraction and expressionism. So, I mean, Basquiat's painting would have been in the Degenerate Art Show for sure. First of all, because they didn't like Negro art, but also because it's expressionist and it's kind of abstract. It's not representational. Whew. All right, so this woodcut over here on the right, there's two images here. A woodcut by Emil Nolde, who actually was a Nazi, but he was still banned by the Nazis. And then here's a very strange photograph of, it seems like a woman holding a Picasso portrait. You can't see the person who's holding this. And it's just weird the way the body in the painting is sort of superimposed on the actual person holding the painting. And another Picasso painting here. And you can see in the mirror, actually, the person who's holding this painting up. So it's a kind of weird photograph. But the reason we only have photographs of what was in the Entartete Kunst show was that almost all of it was destroyed. That is, some of it was sold on the black market, kind of, to raise money for the Nazis' projects. Some of it was just burned, and some of it kind of disappeared into the private collections of various Nazis and resurfaced sometimes decades after the war. But I think these Picasso paintings were lost completely. Let me see if I don't know. Now these were by German expressionists, and I think those were also lost. These were the only. We just have these black and white photographs of a lot of the art that was in that show. Nolde was an interesting case. He not only did woodcuts, he also painted, and he was a card-carrying Nazi. But that didn't save him. They banned him from painting, the Nazis did, and they would come to his studio and inspect his brushes to make sure that he had not been painting, which is really weird. I mean, I guess they didn't have anything in their constitution against unreasonable searches and seizures. That seems like a really unreasonable search or seizure. Anyway, he started painting in watercolor because the brushes dried quicker and he could get away with it, but he couldn't paint with oils. And I think he remained a Nazi. I don't think he quit him because of all that. All right, so this is the kind of stuff they loved, the Nazis loved. And this is still, you can still see this art in Munich and I think in Berlin. One of my friends who went to Germany a couple of summers ago said she had seen a lot of the art from the official German art show in their museums there. So they liked, the Nazis liked art that was realistic, you could say, um, representational, but idealized naturalism. Like most people don't exactly look like these very athletic women or men. You know, most of us are kind of fatter than that or older than that. So what they liked was idealized naturalism, a kind of classical idealism that harkened back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. And we'll look at that stuff in a couple of weeks, and you'll see what I mean by classical idealized classicism. Yeah. And okay, so one thing to think about is why did the Nazis dislike abstraction? Let's go back to some of those paintings. Well, here's an example. Abstraction or semi-abstraction, expressionism. Why did they hate that stuff? And the best answer I think people have been able to come up with is just that when you look at this woodcut by Nolde on the right or these Picasso paintings on the left, no one can tell you exactly what they mean, right? Your interpretation is as good as mine. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that this person on the right has been through a hard time. He looks like, I think it's actually, the title of this woodcut might be Old Testament prophet or just prophet. So somebody who's kind of old, has seen a lot, and maybe is warning people of disasters to come. And similarly, in these Picasso paintings, he went through a period of painting circus people whom he was fascinated with. And a lot of those are kind of sad images of people who migrated from town to town entertaining people. But there's no set meaning. I mean, we can disagree. If we had a discussion in our discussion periods about this woodcut or these paintings, everybody might have a different opinion about what they mean. But when you look at these sculptures in the official or other sculptures from the official German art show, there's no question about what they mean, right? They're conventionally beautiful, they're heroic, they're about the noble German people. There's no room for kind of an individual interpretation. And in a totalitarian state like the Third Reich, individual expression and individual interpretation is sort of a threat to the totalitarian regime. So experimental art, personal art, non-representational art, abstraction, anything that has multiple interpretations was right out. It didn't go with the totalitarian goals of the Third Reich. Okay, but censorship, it's not just a Nazi thing. All right, so in the United States, because of the First Amendment, basically. Oh, one thing I forgot to say about, I want to go back to just a minute. Okay, the Antarktika show was not hidden away in some corner of Munich where nobody would see it. It was attended by millions of people. 2 million people saw it in Munich alone. And then it traveled to 13 cities before the work was destroyed or sold. So it kind of makes you wonder, if the Germans thought this art was so dangerous, why did they want so many people to see it? It's really, it wasn't exactly censored. I mean, it was eventually destroyed or disappeared, but for a while it was, a lot of people in Germany saw it, but they were instructed to hate it, basically. And it kind of makes you wonder if everybody did hate it. And there's a scene in a movie about Gerhard Richter, who we're going to learn about next week. He's a German painter. He's still alive. When he was a little boy in the 1930s, he went to the Antarktika show with his aunt, who took him to see it. And in the movie about Gerhard Richter, he and his aunt sort of are whispering to each other that they like this art that you were supposed to hate. So, I mean, it might have been more than 2 people who actually liked it. But the Nazis, for some reason, thought it was important to for everybody, as many people as possible, to see the terrible, degenerate art. Okay, in the United States, generally, we don't censor art. It's kind of rare that it, but there have been attempts to censor art. And this painting was the object of an attempt to, a censorship attempt. So first I want to explain the censorship laws to you. Okay, in 1973, there was a court case. I'm not sure if it was a Supreme Court ruling or just a lower court ruling, but the ruling was that a work of art may be censored if it meets two conditions. It has to be obscene and it has to lack serious artistic value, both of those things. So obscenity alone is not enough to censor a work of art. It has to also lack serious artistic value. So if you can show that a work of art, famously some of Mapplethorpe's photographs or other works, if you can show that, yes, it may be about sex, but it's not just that, it also has serious artistic value or merit. And in this, but what this painting, and this is a big painting, it's maybe 7 or 8 feet tall. It was in the Brooklyn Museum of Art in New York. And that's a city-owned building, owned by the city of New York. And the mayor at that time was Rudy Giuliani, Trump's lawyer. Okay, so Rudy at that time was the mayor of New York, and he tried to close the Brooklyn Museum because he thought this work of art was blasphemous. Okay, so we don't really have laws against blasphemy in the United States because we have separation of church and state, which means that the state can't tell you which religion to belong to, and therefore no one religion is the state religion, and therefore the state can't prosecute you for criticizing a religion or making fun of a religion. Now, you know, in Saudi Arabia, it's a different story. You can be executed for blasphemy. But in the United States, you don't even get a traffic ticket for blasphemy. So you can make fun of any religion whatsoever in the United States. It's fine. But Giuliani didn't like this. He's Catholic, and he found this painting offensive because, not just offensive, but blasphemous and worthy of censorship, because it contains an unusual art medium, and that is elephant poop, or as it was usually referred to in the writing about this painting, elephant dung. That is, you can imagine how big an elephant cow pie is. So elephants presumably poop a lot. And in Africa, actually, elephant dung was the traditional material. So if you've ever looked closely at a cow pat, you know that it has a lot of grass in it. And manure is used for all kinds of construction, like in adobe mixes and things like that, because there is a lot of grass in it. And it's got a lot of fiber in it, and it can sort of be molded and dried into shapes. Okay, so Chris Ofili, he was an American, went to Nigeria, I think, where he wasn't, his ancestors weren't really from there. And I think his parents are Nigerian, and he went to another part of Africa and learned about this elephant dung as a medium. So where is it on the painting? Okay, well, the pedestals that are holding it up are allegedly made out of elephant dung, and one of the Holy Virgin Mary's breasts is made out of elephant dung. Okay, so again, Chris Ofili grew up Catholic in America. He was an altar boy. He revered the Virgin Mary, and he wanted to make a kind of black Madonna. And let's go to the next slide for just a second, then we'll come back. He knew about these religious paintings in Europe that have a gold background behind the Virgin Mary or the Madonna to indicate her setting in heaven and her holiness. So he used a similar tooled gold leaf background, and he made her into an African Madonna. Now, in addition to that, you can see that there are these little, it looks like bubbles kind of floating around. And, again, visually, it's not that different from these angels' heads and wings on this Cimabue Madonna, which we'll talk about when we get to the Renaissance. The Madonna or Virgin Mary is frequently accompanied by heavenly figures, angels with wings and things. But that's not exactly what these are. What Chris Ofili did was he cut pictures out of porn magazines of buttocks, as Forrest Gump would say, women's buttocks. and he collaged them onto the painting. So when I first looked at this, I thought that they were breasts, but some more observant guys in the classroom pointed out that they were not boobs, they were butts. And I was like, oh, yeah, you're right. Sorry, my bad. Okay, so there are buttocks floating around, sort of like balloons around her. So all this was just too much for Rudy Giuliani and some other people. And they took it to court, and they lost. That is, they were overruled, and the judge said, sorry, this may offend you and your religion, but it's not obscene, and it has artistic merit. And in America, we don't censor art because some people think it's insulting to their religion. We just don't do that here. So it got to stay in the Brooklyn Museum. Now, it was attacked later by an old person with a can of white paint who came in there and painted over it, but it was restored. So this attacks with cans of white paint are sort of a thing, but don't do it. Other people have used cans of white paint to deface art that they didn't like, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Okay, now this painting is from the 1960s. It's an example of pop art, which we're going to get to later. And it was banned by Facebook for a few weeks. So, how did this come about? All right. So, the Philadelphia Museum of Art had a pop art show just a few years ago. The Facebook thing, I think, happened 2017. So the Philadelphia Museum of Art in 2017, they wanted to have a show about pop art from the 1960s. And they wanted to use this image on the poster for that show. And they had posters made that they put up in subways in New York City and in Philadelphia and so on. Um, and they have a Facebook page, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and they put this on their Facebook page saying, "Come to see our pop art show." So, excuse me, Facebook banned it. Okay, so why did Facebook ban it? Well, probably one of their robots banned it, actually, or their algorithm robot, because it had suggestive content. Okay, I think we're all adults here, so let's just say what it suggests. It kind of suggests a blowjob, otherwise known as fellatio. That's the technical term. Yeah, but it's called ice cream. Okay, so the artist, Evelyn Axel, was making this painting at a time when there weren't that many female painters, and especially in pop art, and a lot of pop art male artists were kind of making, she thought, images of women that were stereotyped or kind of showed women as passive sort of objects of male desire or whatever. And she wanted to show a woman not passively being gazed at by men, but actively enjoying her ice cream cone or maybe her blowjob. I don't know. Anyway, so when we've discussed this painting in person, when we had in-person classes back in the day, some people would say that it was ridiculous to assume that this was about a blowjob. And other people would say, no, it's obviously about that. So again, this is subjective, right? It's your interpretation of what you think it's about. And the Nazis probably would hate it for that reason. It's degenerate, right? Even the Facebook robot thought it was kind of degenerate. But Facebook had to backtrack and they had to admit, okay, sorry, our algorithm made a mistake. This is for an art show. It's an art object. You can have it on Facebook. So the Facebook won, or no, Facebook lost, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art got to advertise their show this way. Okay, so that's kind of funny example of censorship, not a very serious one. Now I'm going on to a much more serious one. Okay, so this happened in Houston, where I lived for 15 years, but it happened just a couple of years ago after I left Houston. But I used to go to this place a lot when I lived in Houston. Well, several times anyway. It's called the Rothko Chapel, and it's kind of a shrine for modern art. Inside, this is the chapel here in the background. And inside this chapel, it's a secular or non-denominational chapel. It's not really a Christian chapel. It's just for all religions. Inside it are some paintings, a series of paintings by an American artist, Mark Rothko, and they're abstract paintings. They're sort of color field paintings, and they're amazing. And sitting in the Rothko Chapel, surrounded by these paintings, for a lot of people is a very spiritual and deep and emotional experience. But what happened was, outside the chapel, there's this sculpture by Barnett Newman, who's also a sort of a contemporary of Rothko and also an abstract painter like Rothko. But he also made some sculptures, and this is one of his most famous sculptures. It's called Broken Obelisk. Okay, so what is an obelisk? An obelisk is like the Washington Monument. That is a tall, pointy, just a pointy thing sticking out of the ground that's tall and pointy. That's an obelisk, okay? And the Washington Monument is sort of our obelisk. But this broken obelisk, and you can see where it's kind of broken off here, is mounted sort of upside down on a pyramid. And it's made out of steel. And as years have gone by, the steel has kind of corroded a little bit because of moisture and rain and air and so on. And so it's weathered steel, you could say. And it doesn't seem terribly offensive, right? It's just an abstract sculpture. Some people find it wonderful. Some people say that the obelisk is like a beam of light being projected from the crown of the pyramid. Um, so maybe it's some sort of statement of redemption or resurrection or something like that. But it is broken. I mean, that's what it's called. So in 2018, May of 2018, so a little over 2 years ago, this sculpture was attacked during the night in Houston. And some people, a vandal, or maybe more than one, poured white paint into the reflecting pool here that it's mounted in. And I think got some paint on the obelisk itself and scattered handbills, that is, posters, pieces of paper, 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper around the site that read, "It's okay to be white." I think we all agree. Yes, it's fine. You can't help it. You're white. All right. So nobody can help what race they are. So it's just kind of weird. Like, why would somebody do that? Why would somebody pour white paint into the reflecting pool and essentially write over and over, "It's okay to be white"? I mean, it's incomprehensible unless you know the backstory. Okay, so here's the backstory. Newman created this in 1967. And Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April of 1968, as you may know. And in May of 1969, the Menil family in Houston, who were prominent art patrons, decided to purchase he made 4 or 5 versions of this, Barnett Newman did. And they wanted to buy one of them and donate it to the city of Houston and have it erected in front of the Houston City Hall in honor of and memory of Martin Luther King Jr. The Menils were also civil rights advocates in Houston. And Houston was one of the first cities in the United States to desegregate lunch counters, which seems incredible to us. But in the 1950s, there were certain places where black people couldn't eat lunch. Like, you couldn't go into a drugstore if you were a black person and sit down at a normal drugstore counter and order a hamburger. Only white people were allowed to do that. So desegregating lunch counters, that was a big deal in Nashville, and it was a big deal in Houston. Houston was one of the first cities to sort of peacefully desegregate lunch places and restaurants and things. So, there was a civil rights movement in Houston. It wasn't the civil rights struggle in Houston wasn't as dramatic as it was in Nashville or Birmingham or places like that. But nonetheless, Houston had that history in the 1960s. So the Menils wanted to erect this monument to dedicate this broken obelisk to Martin Luther King Jr. The city of Houston turned them down and said, "No, we don't want that. We don't want anything dedicated to Martin Luther King in front of our city hall." So the Menils bought it anyway and installed it at the Rothko Chapel, which was their project on the campus of the St. Thomas University, which is a college in Houston that they had given a lot of money to, and including the money to build the Rothko Chapel. So they bought this sculpture and put it next to the Rothko Chapel. And that seemed like a done deal. Okay, it's not in the middle of town to offend people. Now it's off behind the Rothko Chapel. Some people have not forgotten. Okay, so 2018 is like 50 years later, I guess, after the Menils wanted to install it at City Hall. Some people have long memories. So to them, this obelisk is like an affront because it was once associated with Martin Luther King Jr. or something like that. So that's why they defaced it. Um, Weird, huh? Okay. So and I could talk more about other works of art that have actually been attacked. Another one of Barnett Newman's paintings was attacked by a guy with a box cutter, and the guy just slashed the painting. Is a big abstract painting. Again, it's hard to understand the motivation. Like, what could be so offensive about an abstract painting? I don't know. I mean, it's hard to understand why the Nazis hated abstract art. Oh, well, okay. I put this photograph in here because the Menils kind of saw a connection. The reason they wanted to name the sculpture dedicated to Martin Luther King was they saw a connection between his couple of speeches that he made in Washington. This is not the big one, the I Have a Dream speech, but this was an earlier one in the 50s that he made on the mall in Washington, D.C., opposite the Washington Monument, which is an obelisk, which you can see in the distance. So when Barnett Newman made Broken Obelisk, the Menils believed that it was a reference to the sort of broken dream of America. That is, the promise of America that all people are created equal was broken by slavery and by Jim Crow and all of that. And the civil rights movement was an effort to rectify those broken promises and to make them come true, that everybody is created equal. So they saw this upside down broken obelisk as a reference to the Washington Monument. Here's another. This is from the big march on Washington in 1967, or maybe early 1968. One of the biggest mass demonstrations that ever happened in Washington, D.C., where King made the famous I Have a Dream speech. Okay, so maybe the Vandals made that connection too. I mean, it's possible that this work of art aroused such rage in them because they agreed with the Menils, essentially, that this is a sculpture about broken promises, and it is about America. It's not just an abstract thing. It has all these meanings that have to do with history and its context and references that it makes to the Washington Monument and so on. So in a way, censorship or an attack on a work of art is almost like saying, yes, this work of art is meaningful. It means a lot, and I hate that. So it's kind of a backwards compliment in a way to Barnett Newman. Anyway, they cleaned it all up. The Menil didn't. The Rothko Chapel staff got rid of the white paint and cleaned up the mess, and it's fine now. So, and the painting that was attacked by also a white supremacist, weirdly, was repaired, the Barnett Newman painting. So I still don't understand why that painting was offensive. Okay, so I'm going to stop the share now and go back to, okay, so there should be plenty of material there in that lecture for you to come up with a good discussion question. Because we talked about a lot of controversial and interesting works of art. So I'm guessing you won't have any trouble writing a discussion question. And I am going to drive to North Carolina tomorrow, Wednesday, and find some internet so I can run the discussion class on Friday, as usual. I'm pretty sure I can swing that. But if I can't, I'll email you if it's just going to be impossible. Um, but I hope to see you then. And so I'm going to stop recording. Bye.